So, podcast 3, Origin of Life. So now we have cells. We have first life. What then? Okay. First cells. This is a little calendar of life, if you will. It's really hard for us to think in terms of the geologic scale of planet Earth, but remembering that Earth is believed to have been formed around 4.6 billion years ago, and that we have no real ability in our heads to imagine that span of time and how incredibly long that is, okay? But let's look at here. Origin of Earth, okay? 4.6 roughly billion years ago, all right? Now, the origin of life comes along, again, nobody was there with a notebook, but around 3.5 to 4 billion, years ago. And what would this life have looked like? It would have been prokaryotic. And we do have early fossils of the very early prokaryotes that we can point to. So let's say we're looking, if this is 4 billion somewhere and this is 3, so 3, somewhere in this ballpark. I think this is clearly trying to indicate that maybe they originated along this about 3.7 billion years ago, something like that. Prokaryotes, the simplest cells, they lack a nucleus. They are essentially sacs of cytoplasm that possess ribosomes, okay? They often have a cell wall, not always, but often, but they have a single ring of DNA, not a nucleus, mind you, just a ring-shaped DNA molecule floating free in the cytoplasm. They have ribosomes in the cytoplasm that are there to create proteins based on what this DNA tells them to create, and that's it. Extremely simple, but extremely successful. And when I say simple, let's be careful. Just because these are the simplest life forms does not mean they are simple. Humans have not been able to create a bacterium yet. While that is true that they are the simplest life forms, still amazingly complex and clever in their construction. Okay? Prokaryotes dominated life on Earth from when they were originated, from the first prokaryote until about, honestly, till currently. They are still everywhere. They are extremely successful, but they were the only game in town for a very, very, very long time, until around 2.5 billion to 2 billion years ago. They were the only life forms on the planet. So they were here all by themselves for an incredibly long time. This is an image of a fossil prokaryote, and you can see the image of a actual prokaryote that is alive today. This one's 3.5 billion years old. Modern bacteria, these are cyanobacteria, or photosynthetic bacteria that we have around today, and they look remarkably similar. Okay. Indeed, stromatolites are fossilized mats of prokaryotes, and these folks are standing in mats of bacteria today that look, and these are the fossilized stromatolites that are in various places around the planet, and their structure is very similar to the living bacteria that these folks are standing in right here. So we can kind of look at these fossils and turn around and look at our living bacteria and say, yeah, this is probably a whole lot what the early life on Earth looked like. Of course, all of this would have originated in water-based. There would have been no life on land yet. It would have all been this water-based life forms, at least as best we can tell. Okay. Now, again, please remember this early Earth, when life first formed, would not have been like what the Earth we are on now. There was no oxygen. So it was not until 2.7 billion years ago, more or less, that oxygen actually accumulates in the atmosphere enough that it can start to be used by other living things. Ironically, this presence of oxygen in the atmosphere leads to the very first mass extinction ever, because we've already talked about how oxygen breaks things down. And if you were a living thing that couldn't handle this oxygen stripping your electrons from your molecules, then you were not going to make it. It's only those things that could handle the activities of oxygen that survived and actually adapted to use this oxygen in their daily life. Okay? So we see that oxygen, again, we're talking origin of life somewhere in this ballpark here. Oxygen doesn't come along until, 2.5, 2.7 billion years ago. Where did this oxygen come from? The photosynthetic bacteria we were just looking at back here, these stromatolites, these cyanobacteria, bacteria that had developed the process of photosynthesis, of course started expelling oxygen gas as a waste product, quote unquote, and that eventually filled the air with the oxygen that we have today. Okay? So now our atmosphere has gone from being a reducing one to an oxidizing one. We are now no longer going to get the spontaneous formation of organic monomers. The only organic monomers that are going to get made are going to be made by us, by and large. The evidence of when the iron arrived on planet Earth is found in the rocks. Wherever we see rust in rock layers because of iron reacting with oxygen, we know that's when oxygen was plentiful enough in the atmosphere to actually cause that rusting. Okay? And we already mentioned that photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria, if you are an artist, you know cyan is the color blue-green, and they are that color because of the chlorophyll that they contain. These photosynthetic bacteria, they are who gave us our oxygen originally. All right, now, all of this is fantastic, but again, we have been talking about prokaryotic life. Where did the first eukaryotic life, and it's very important that you know what a eukaryote is. It is a cell with an actual nucleus with internal compartments, a complex cell. It is the cells of which you are made, okay? Every cell that is on Earth that is not a bacteria, that is not a prokaryote, is a eukaryote. Okay, so this development of internal membranes is critical. This image down here is kind of trying to give you an idea of how this evolutionarily might have proceeded. You have a prokaryotic cell that begins to get some infoldings of the cell membrane that create, if not true compartments, regions that can be somewhat protected from the rest of the cell. And perhaps that increased was favored for whatever reason. Natural selection favored that. It made the organism more successful. It was able to reproduce more often. And then finally we get this more complex compartmentalized cell with its separate nucleus and so on, that we would recognize as a true eukaryotic cell. Okay? The benefits of eukaryotes are that we get this creation of little microenvironments inside of the larger cellular environment. So in these little pockets, in these little places where things are now going to be separated, we can have different processes going on in these protected microenvironments, these protected compartments that might not be able to be compatible with other activities going on in the cell. Okay? Obvious advantage here is the ability to specialize. Specialization, processes happening in one place and not another, and allow for increased efficiency. We can have catabolic processes, breaking down, digesting type processes going on in this space, and building processes, anabolic processes going on in a different space. Those two processes are at odds with each other, but if we can separate them, they can occur inside the cell without interfering with each other. Natural selection evidently favored this compartmentalization because eukaryotic cells took off. endosymbiosis is a very important event that allowed for even further compartmentalization inside of a eukaryotic cell. And so, endo means inside, symbiosis, remember, is that long-term relationship between members of different species. And the idea is that once single-celled eukaryotes evolved on the planet, some eukaryotes, some large cell, might have engulfed a smaller prokaryotic cell. And we see that happening here. This is called endocytosis, where a cell, much like an amoeba, wraps its cytoplasm, cell membrane around a prey item and engulfs it to eat it. But in this case, the eating part, the digesting part, doesn't happen. In fact, this little prokaryotic cell here becomes protected by the cell membrane that it wrapped around it and created kind of a little food vacuole type of situation. It becomes encased in that and starts providing the host cell with some stuff that's beneficial to the host. So there we have the engulfing of the bacterium, and they begin to engage in a mutualistic relationship. If this bacterium was the ancestor to our mitochondria that are organelles inside of our cells today, it certainly would have provided its ancestor with what it is providing for us today: energy. These mitochondria are excellent energy makers. They convert glucose to energy. It would have provided perhaps some of this energy to the cell. The cell agrees not to digest it and in fact provides it with a protected place to live, and that might have been favored. So we're talking a mutualistic type of relationship between an ancient bacterium and an ancient eukaryotic cell that engulfed it. Okay? Chloroplasts are believed to have originated in essentially exactly the same way, by a cell that already had consumed and evolved into this energy efficient eukaryote with mitochondria as organelles now, would have my image is starting up here. This is the first step. So we've already got this much has already occurred evolutionarily. Now we're going to engulf this photosynthetic bacterium right here. So maybe a type of cyanobacteria of some sort, photosynthetic organism. And rather than getting digested, it again gets protected in a membrane coating and starts providing not with energy but with food. So this is going to provide the host with food. The host again agrees not to eat it and provides it with a nice place to live. Again, a mutualistic relationship. Again, natural selection would favor it because this larger cell would be much better able to survive because now it's got a food source. So this might be the ancestor of all of our photosynthetic eukaryotes today. Okay? So this theory of endosymbiosis was first developed in 1967 by this lady, Lynn Margulis. While initially people just disregarded her ideas as being crazy, there is piles of evidence today, and it is generally accepted that this is almost certainly how these organelles, mitochondria and chloroplasts, two of our most critical organelles as eukaryotes, came to exist. The evidence is structural. First of all, both mitochondria and chloroplasts resemble bacteria. Their insides look like bacteria. They have this double membrane layer, which is believed to have come from partially their own membrane, but then a membrane that was placed around them as they were engulfed by the host bacteria. So the double, and it's probably pretty important for you to recognize that, the double membrane layer on the outside. There is genetic evidence. They both have their own DNA. It is DNA that is in the shape of a ring or a circle. So you've got this double helix, but it's in a ring, and that's exactly what bacterial DNA looks like. And they have their own. They still have it, at least some of it. They move freely inside the cell. They actually reproduce independently inside the cell. They go through what looks like binary fission, which is the exact way that bacteria still reproduce today. So there's all kinds of evidence. The double membrane, they have their own genes, they reproduce inside the cell. They look and act just like bacteria look and act, but they have obviously developed as organelles to this point. You can't take a mitochondrion out and it will live independently anymore. It is completely dependent on the larger eukaryotic cell, but still retains many of those bacterial characteristics. All right, so we finally got eukaryotes here around a little less than 2 billion years ago. And once we get this specialization of cells, it's not long before we start to see multicellularity arise, not really super complex, but multicellular eukaryotes specializing even more, having different cells doing different jobs, and so on. But what is of most interest is this mark right here, around 550, 540, 560, depending on what textbook you read, million. And remember, now we are into the millions, so much more recent than the billions of years we're talking about back here. We see an explosion called the Cambrian explosion that happened around 543 million years ago, where this boom of diverse multicellular animal and plant life takes off. Remember, up till now, we are still in the water. The land is still bare. There are no plants. There are no animals running around. It is rock. That's it. It is not until this Cambrian explosion where finally we start to, very soon after that, see some organisms taking advantage of the land. Okay? Within 10 to 20 million years, the blink of an eye, evolutionarily in the history of the Earth speaking, most of the major phyla of animals are all of a sudden, boom, there. Okay? Now, as we watch from like this very, the great vast majority of Earth's history is either prokaryotic or prokaryotic and eukaryotic coming into existence. After this Cambrian explosion, which is here, this very short is really the vast majority of life on Earth. This Cambrian explosion, we see this rise in life forms, okay? And we see rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall as some, you get more, you get less, some go extinct, whatever. Then we see a mass extinction that occurs at the end of what is called the Permian period. It's a huge mass extinction. Almost all species on Earth go extinct, thought to be due to volcanic eruptions, climate factors, and so on. Then after that, we see rebounding, and then another mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, which is the dinosaur mass extinction that we're all most familiar with. The Cretaceous mass extinction thought to be caused by this meteorite / asteroid, whatever you want to call it, that strikes the Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula and creates havoc, climate change, and all kinds of stuff that eventually leads to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And once we get rid of the dinosaurs, we open up new niches that allow the mammals to thrive. And so you can see that once we get rid of the dinosaurs here, the mammals begin to take off, and we get this huge rise in the mammalian population. So The tree of life then is essentially made up of 3 domains, okay? This is above the level of kingdom, all right? So these things are so dissimilar, they cannot even be put in the same kingdom together. We are separating them out at a very basic level. These are the bacteria, okay? The archaea, which if we looked at them, we would say, oh, they're bacteria, but they are so different from these bacteria that they cannot even be in the same domain. They are that different. And then the eukaryotes, which is us and all the other eukaryotic organisms on the earth. You can see fungi, plants, these are all protists, little single-celled eukaryotes, the animals there. All of us are in this one domain. Now, if you look here, what you will see is the archaeans. This group of bacteria is thought to share a common ancestor with us, much more so than these other regular bacteria are. Archaea just means kind of ancient bacteria. So we will talk more about those domains as when we get into our evolution unit. Okay? All right. So that is a real brief overview of what would have happened after life originated, and we got through those eukaryotic cells and some major evolutionary events that would have happened after that. All right. So that's it. We're done with origin of life until we hit evolution again, and we want to recap some of this. And we are now going to head into our talk about cells. All right. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next podcast. Take care.